The sun had barely risen, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet streets, as Marcus Carter stood in front of the bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his cufflinks. His reflection revealed a tall, muscular man in his late 30s, wearing an expression that was more serious than most people his age. His uniform, neatly pressed and hanging in the closet, was left behind for the day. Today was his one rare day off, a small reprieve from the relentless grind of being a police officer in a city where tensions were always just beneath the surface. Linda, his wife, still lay sleeping, her arm draped across his side of the bed. They had been married for 10 years, and despite the challenges that came with his job, the long hours, the danger, the stress, she had stood by him through it all. This upcoming anniversary, Marcus wanted to do something special for her, something that would show her how much she meant to him. It wasn't easy being the wife of a cop, and Linda deserved more than the late nights and hurried dinners they often shared. His thoughts turned to the luxury store downtown, where he'd spotted a bracelet a few weeks back, delicate silver, with a sapphire charm that he knew Linda would love. It was a little out of his price range, but Marcus had been saving for months. He wanted something that would remind her of him, something tangible in those moments when his job pulled him away for days on end. With one last glance in the mirror, Marcus grabbed his keys and quietly slipped out the door, hoping to return with the bracelet before Linda woke up. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of fall. As he made his way downtown, Marcus found himself lost in thought, reflecting on how far he had come. Growing up, Marcus had always dreamed of becoming a police officer. He believed in justice, fairness, and protecting the innocent. But as the years passed, the rose-tinted glasses of his childhood dreams had faded, replaced by a harsh reality. The badge he wore with pride didn't always protect him, especially when he wasn't in uniform. Despite his accomplishments, there were still places where he was treated with suspicion, places where people saw his skin before they saw his character. He knew all too well the feeling of being judged before even speaking a word. It was in the sideways glances from store employees, the quick double takes from strangers. These subtle moments of prejudice had become so ingrained in his life that he barely reacted anymore. But even as the years passed, it still stung in a way that never truly went away. Approaching the glass doors of the luxury store, Marcus felt that familiar sense of unease. It wasn't the kind of store he frequented often, too expensive, too posh. But today was different. Today, he had a purpose. The shop was sleek and elegant, its walls lined with shimmering displays of gold, silver, and diamonds. The staff, all impeccably dressed in tailored suits, looked up as Marcus entered, their gazes lingering on him a fraction longer than they had on the other customers. It wasn't overt. No one said anything. But Marcus noticed. He always noticed. He walked toward the jewelry section, scanning the cases for the bracelet he had seen online. His mind was focused on his task, but his senses were heightened. Years of training had made him hyper-aware of his surroundings, and something felt off. The energy in the room was tense, more so than the usual hustle and bustle of a luxury store. Marcus glanced around, his eyes settling on a group of men near the back. They didn't fit the typical profile of the store's usual clientele. They weren't browsing with the same casual interest as the other shoppers. Instead, they seemed jittery, glancing around nervously, exchanging hushed words. His instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. The saleswoman approached Marcus, her smile warm but her eyes cautious. "Can I help you with something, sir?" "Yeah," Marcus said, keeping his tone polite. "I'm looking for a bracelet. It has a sapphire charm." The woman nodded, leading him to a display case. "We have a few pieces like that. Let me show you." As she unlocked the case, Marcus kept one eye on the men in the back. He wasn't on duty, but old habits died hard. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Then, it happened. The door slammed shut, the sound of heavy footsteps filling the room. Marcus's hand instinctively reached for his waistband, but his gun wasn't there. He was off duty, unarmed. The group of men moved swiftly, pulling out weapons and shouting commands. One of them pointed his weapon toward the cashier, while another ordered the customers to the ground. "Everyone on the floor, now!" Panic spread like wildfire. Shoppers screamed, scrambling to follow the orders. The saleswoman in front of Marcus dropped to her knees, her face pale with terror. Marcus crouched low, trying to remain calm as his mind raced through the options. He could try to stop them, but he was outnumbered, unarmed, and there were civilians everywhere. One wrong move could make things worse. But doing nothing wasn't an option. He couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt. Slowly, Marcus inched his way toward a display case, using it as cover. He could see the men more clearly now. 3 of them, all armed, but none of them seemed particularly experienced. Their movements were erratic, their hands shaking. They were nervous, desperate. That made them even more dangerous. The leader of the group was barking orders, his voice rising in frustration as the cashier fumbled with the register. One of the other men began stuffing jewelry into a bag, while the third kept watch over the hostages. Marcus knew he had to act, and fast. If he could disarm one of them, he might be able to take control of the situation, but he had to be careful. One wrong move, and things could spiral out of control. Taking a deep breath, Marcus waited for the right moment. When the man closest to him turned his back, Marcus made his move. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the ground as the man yelped in pain, and Marcus shoved him to the floor. The other 2 men turned in surprise, but Marcus didn't give them time to react. He grabbed the gun from the floor and aimed it at them. "Drop it," he shouted, his voice calm but authoritative. "Drop it now." For a moment it seemed like they might listen. But then, the leader of the group raised his weapon, and Marcus had no choice but to fire. The shot rang out, echoing through the store, and the leader dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The third man, seeing his accomplices fall, threw his gun down and raised his hands in surrender. The room fell silent, the tension broken only by the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding as the police arrived. He had done what he had to do. He had saved lives. But as the officers stormed into the store, their guns drawn, Marcus quickly realized that his role in this story was far from over. The piercing sound of sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each second as Marcus stood in the middle of the luxury store. The acrid smell of fear still hung heavy in the air, and the hostages, now freed from the immediate threat of the robbers, began to stir. Some of them were sobbing quietly, others simply frozen in place, too shocked to move after the chaos that had just erupted. Marcus's adrenaline was still pumping, but his training kept him steady. His gaze darted between the subdued robbers and the approaching officers, watching them storm through the entrance. He raised his hands, showing them the gun he had taken from the assailants, hoping they would immediately understand who he was. After all, he was one of them, a fellow officer. Surely, they would recognize the situation for what it was, an off-duty officer preventing a robbery. But the officers didn't stop to assess the situation. Their eyes were wide, weapons drawn, and in that instant, Marcus realized they weren't seeing a hero standing in the wreckage of a failed robbery. They weren't seeing the man who had saved the store from complete devastation. They saw a black man with a gun. "Drop the weapon," one of the officers shouted, his voice sharp with authority. Marcus immediately placed the gun down on the ground, raising both hands in the air. "I'm Officer Marcus Carter, badge number." "Get on the ground," the same officer interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. His gun was still aimed directly at Marcus, as if he were one of the criminals. "I'm a cop," Marcus repeated more firmly this time, his voice calm but resolute. "Check my ID. It's in my wallet. I'm off duty, but Now," another officer barked. Marcus could feel the tension in the room tightening like a vice. He'd been in enough tense situations to know that one wrong move could turn deadly. Despite the frustration and humiliation boiling inside him, he complied. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the floor, placing his hands behind his head as the officers swarmed around him. "Hands behind your back," one officer yelled, even as Marcus had already done so. He felt the cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs snap around his wrists. The weight of it sent a wave of humiliation through his body. He had stopped a robbery, prevented innocent people from being harmed, and yet here he was, face down on the floor of the store, treated like a common criminal. "Check his ID," the store managers called out from behind the counter. She had finally gathered herself after the terror of the robbery and was standing now, trembling but resolute. He saved us. That man saved us. But the officers weren't listening. They were too focused on maintaining control of the scene, too focused on the visual they couldn't look past. Marcus, handcuffed and kneeling on the floor, surrounded by chaos. The confusion in the store only seemed to grow. Customers were beginning to stand up, murmuring among themselves, unsure of what had just happened. Some of them cast confused glances at Marcus, the man who had just risked his life for them, now restrained as if he had been part of the crime. A few customers who had witnessed his heroics tried to step forward, but the officers waved them back. "Stay where you are," one officer shouted to the crowd, his voice a mixture of panic and control. As Marcus knelt there, a flood of memories washed over him, unbidden but all too familiar. He had been here before, not in this exact spot, but in this place of being misjudged, of having to prove himself in a world that too often saw his skin before it saw his soul. It had happened when he was a teenager, getting stopped and frisked on his way home from basketball practice. It had happened again when he was a rookie, where fellow officers made subtle offhand comments about guys like him being a little too familiar with certain neighborhoods. And now, even after years of service, after putting his life on the line for this city, he was right back in that place, right back in the box they had tried to put him in all his life. "Officer Marcus Carter." "Check my badge number," he said again, his voice calm but laced with a frustration that he worked hard to control. He couldn't let the anger take over. Not now. Not here. One of the officers finally knelt down, rummaging through Marcus's wallet, pulling out his police ID. The officer's face twisted slightly as he read it, confusion flickering across his features. He's a cop," the officer muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. The lead officer, the one who had been barking the commands, paused for a moment, lowering his gun slightly but not relaxing his stance. "Why didn't you say so?" he asked, though his tone was accusatory rather than apologetic. "I did," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "Twice." The officer's eyes narrowed, his posture stiff. It was clear he didn't like being corrected, especially in front of his colleagues. He stood up, motioning for one of the other officers to remove the handcuffs. The relief of being freed was brief, overshadowed by the humiliation that still hung in the air. Marcus rubbed his wrists, standing slowly. "You should have identified yourself immediately," the lead officer continued, unwilling to let it go. "I did," Marcus repeated, his patience hanging by a thread. He looked the officer in the eye, willing himself to stay calm. "I tried." The officer didn't respond. He turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there with the unmistakable message that this incident would be brushed off, that there would be no apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake. Around him, the store was beginning to return to some semblance of normalcy. The subdued criminals were being led out in handcuffs, while paramedics tended to the few people who had been injured in the panic. The store manager approached Marcus, her face pale and strained, but her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you did back there. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Marcus nodded, offering her a faint smile. "Just doing my job, even when I'm not officially on duty." But the weight of what had just happened lingered. He had saved them, yes. He had stopped a robbery, protected innocent lives. But in the end, none of that mattered in the moment when the officers had arrived. They hadn't seen him as a hero. They had seen a threat. And that reality, more than the robbery itself, was what stayed with Marcus as he left the store, the bracelet for his wife still forgotten in the chaos. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The sky was overcast when Marcus walked out of the store, but the weight of the events inside hung over him far more heavily than the gathering clouds. His wrists still stung where the handcuffs had dug into his skin, but it wasn't the physical pain that bothered him. It was the lingering sense of betrayal, by his own no less. He had grown up learning to trust the system, to believe in the badge, to believe in justice. But today, that trust had been shattered in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. As he walked down the street, away from the luxury store, he tried to gather his thoughts. He hadn't even had a chance to buy the bracelet for Linda. The whole ordeal had stolen the small joy he had hoped to bring her. The shock of being mistaken for a criminal, despite his repeated assertions of who he was, stuck with him like a bad dream he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking through his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing Linda's name flash across the screen. For a moment, he hesitated. What would he even tell her? How could he explain what had just happened without breaking her heart? With a deep breath, he answered. "Hey, babe," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey." Linda's voice came through, soft and filled with warmth. "Where are you? You left early? Everything okay?" Marcus swallowed the knot in his throat. He didn't want to worry her, not right now. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just ran into a little situation." "A situation?" Linda's tone shifted slightly, concern creeping in. "What happened?" Marcus paused, debating how much to tell her. He was about to answer when the sound of screeching tires and flashing lights suddenly filled the street. A police cruiser pulled up alongside him, and Marcus's heart sank. "Not again. Gotta call you back," Marcus said quickly, hanging up before Linda could ask any more questions. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their faces set in grim lines. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a rigid posture, approached Marcus with a look that made it clear this wasn't a social call. "Marcus Carter?" the officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yeah, that's me," Marcus replied, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "We're placing you under arrest for suspicion of involvement in the robbery at the luxury store." Marcus blinked, disbelief washing over him. "Are you kidding me? I stopped that robbery. I'm the one who—" "You're going to need to come with us," the officer interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. He grabbed Marcus by the arm, pulling him toward the cruiser. "You can explain it downtown." Marcus felt a surge of frustration and anger rising within him. He yanked his arm free, stepping back, his eyes blazing. "I'm a cop. Check my record. I'm the one who took down those robbers. This is a mistake." The second officer, a younger man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Look, man, we're just following orders. Someone from the store claimed you might have been involved, and we've been told to bring you in for questioning. We don't make the rules." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. Someone from the store? One of the employees? The very people he had saved? He glanced back toward the luxury store in the distance, his mind racing. Who would have made such an accusation? "I'm not going anywhere until you check with my precinct," Marcus said firmly. "I've served this city for years. You can't just haul me in based on some baseless accusation." The older officer, clearly losing patience, stepped forward, his hands still gripping the cuffs. "This isn't up for debate, Carter. You can either come with us voluntarily, or we can do this the hard way. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus clenched his fists. Every muscle in his body tensed with the injustice of it all. He had always believed in the system, believed that if you followed the rules, did your job, and worked hard, the system would protect you. But here he was, standing in front of two officers who were treating him like a suspect, despite knowing he wore the same badge. Reluctantly, he took a step back and raised his hands, letting them see that he wouldn't resist. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get this over with." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists for the second time that day, a hollow feeling settled in Marcus's chest. The officers placed him in the back of the cruiser, and as the door slammed shut, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been here before, not as a police officer, but as a black man growing up in a world that was all too quick to judge him. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Marcus stared out the window, his mind churning with thoughts. What would happen when they got downtown? Would anyone vouch for him? Would they believe him? Or would the accusation from the store employee, whoever it was, be enough to cast doubt on his character? And what would Linda think when she found out? The ride to the station was silent. The tension thick in the air. Marcus could feel the eyes of the officers on him in the rearview mirror, but they didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The damage was already done. In their minds, he was a suspect until proven otherwise. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was led inside, the familiar hum of the precinct feeling foreign and cold. He had been here hundreds of times before, but now as he was marched through the hallway in handcuffs, the stares from his colleagues stung like daggers. Some of them looked away, uncomfortable, while others watched with thinly veiled suspicion. Marcus was led into an interrogation room and left there, the door closing with a heavy thud. He sat in the hard metal chair, his wrists still bound, and tried to calm his racing heart. He knew this wasn't just about the robbery anymore. This was about something much deeper, something he had been fighting against his whole life. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, the door opened, and Lieutenant Jackson, his direct superior, walked in. Jackson was a tall man with a square jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor. He had always been tough but fair, someone Marcus had respected from the moment they started working together. But today, Jackson's face was unreadable. He sat down across from Marcus, his hands folded on the table. "Marcus," he began, his tone measured, "we've received some serious accusations. One of the store employees claims that you might have been involved in the planning of the robbery. Apparently, they recognized you from a previous visit." Marcus felt like the air had been knocked out of him. "That's ridiculous, Lieutenant. I went there to buy a gift for my wife. I've never met those robbers before in my life." Jackson sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I believe you, Marcus, but it's not about what I believe. It's about the evidence, and right now, the story isn't lining up in your favor." Marcus stared at Jackson, his frustration boiling over. "You know me, Jackson. You know I've never done anything like this. Why would I risk my career, my life, for a robbery?" "I know," Jackson said quietly. "But you also know how this works. We've got to investigate. I've already got internal affairs breathing down my neck on this one." Marcus slumped in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on him. He had fought so hard to get where he was, to prove himself in a world that was always ready to knock him down. And now, because of one false accusation, everything he had built was crumbling around him. "Let me go home, Jackson," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking. "Let me explain this to my wife. She deserves to hear it from me, not from the news." Jackson hesitated, clearly torn. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll see what I can do." As Marcus was led back to the holding area, he couldn't help but feel that something much larger was at play. This wasn't just about a robbery gone wrong. This was about his identity, his place in the world, and the uphill battle he had always fought to be seen as more than just a suspect. The world outside had shifted in the hours Marcus had been at the station. When Jackson finally agreed to let him go home, it was already evening. The air was cooler now, and the city seemed to hum with an energy Marcus couldn't quite place. As he walked out of the precinct, free but not unscathed, a gnawing sense of dread tightened in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. His phone had been buzzing relentlessly in his pocket. The moment he had stepped outside, he checked his notifications, missed calls from Linda, several texts from colleagues asking what had happened, and, most troubling, a few messages from numbers he didn't recognize. One text stood out, sent just an hour ago. "Saw you on the news, man. What the hell is going on?" Marcus's stomach dropped. The news? He hadn't even realized how quickly the story had spread. Before he could open the news app, his phone rang. It was Linda again. He answered, his heart pounding. "Marcus," Linda's voice was tight, a mixture of concern and frustration. "Where are you? What's happening? I've been calling for hours." "I'm out," Marcus said quickly, trying to calm her. "I'm on my way home now. I'll explain everything when I get there." "Explain what? Why are people calling me, asking if you were arrested? What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He had wanted to protect her from this, to keep the details from her until he could explain everything face to face, but the situation had spun out of control faster than he could have imagined. The media had already gotten hold of the story, and now, not only did his reputation hang in the balance, but Linda was being dragged into it as well. "I'm almost home," he said quietly. "I'll explain everything when I see you." The ride home was silent, each minute stretching on like an eternity. When he pulled into the driveway, Marcus took a moment to collect himself. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped out of the car and made his way to the front door. Before he could even reach the porch, the door swung open, and Linda stood there, her face pale, eyes wide with worry. "Marcus," she started, her voice shaking. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. For a few moments, neither of them said anything. He could feel the tension in her body, the unspoken questions, the fear. She had always been strong, his rock through every storm, but this was different. Finally, he pulled back, looking into her eyes. "It's not what it looks like, Linda. I swear, I was just trying to help." "I know," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the news? They're saying you were involved in the robbery, that you might have been working with those criminals." Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of those words hitting him harder than he expected. "It's not true. None of it is true. I was there to stop the robbery, not be part of it. But someone from the store, a staff member I think, accused me of being involved. I don't know why, but that's all it took to get me arrested." Linda stepped back, her brow furrowed. "But why would they do that? Why would they accuse you?" "I don't know." Marcus admitted, his frustration seeping into his voice. "Maybe they thought I didn't belong there. Maybe they panicked. Maybe it's just easier to believe that someone like me could be a criminal rather than a cop trying to help." Linda's eyes welled with tears and she shook her head. "This isn't right, Marcus. You've given everything to this city. How can they turn on you like this?" "I wish I had an answer," he replied quietly. "But right now, we've got bigger problems. The media's already picked up the story. I don't know how, but it's out there. And now the whole city's going to have an opinion on whether I'm guilty or innocent before I even get a chance to clear my name." Linda wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Then we fight. We fight back, Marcus. You're not alone in this." They went inside, and Marcus sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. Sure enough, the news outlets had already latched onto the story. Headlines screamed across the screen: "Officer involved in jewelry store robbery, shocking accusation rocks the city. Hero or criminal, investigation ongoing in bizarre store heist," and even more troubling, community divided over black officer's role in robbery. The last headline hit Marcus the hardest. It wasn't just about him being a cop. It was about him being a black cop. The unspoken undercurrent of race had seeped into the narrative, just as he feared it would. The comments under the articles were a mixture of support and vitriol. Some people were quick to defend him, pointing out his spotless record and years of service, while others were more than willing to believe the worst. "I always knew something was off about that guy. How many times do we see this? Crooked cops thinking they can get away with anything. He probably thought he could use his badge to cover his tracks. Lock him up." Marcus put the phone down, a bitter taste in his mouth. It didn't matter what the facts were anymore. Public opinion was already turning against him. The narrative was out of his control, and the more people talked, the more distorted the truth became. Linda sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "What do we do now?" "We need to clear my name," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. He knew it wouldn't be that simple. The investigation was still ongoing, and with internal affairs involved, it could drag on for weeks, even months. Meanwhile, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard to build, was being torn apart by people who didn't even know him. And then there was the question of who had accused him in the first place. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Someone at the store had seen him, a black man in a luxury setting, and made a snap judgment. But why had it stuck? Why hadn't his identity as an officer been enough to clear him on the spot? "I'll talk to a lawyer," Marcus said after a moment. "I need someone to help me navigate this. It's not just about the arrest anymore. The media's involved, and that changes everything." The next few days passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers, interviews with internal affairs, and countless discussions with his superiors at the precinct. Some of his colleagues stood by him, offering words of support and solidarity. But others remained distant, their silence speaking volumes. The media frenzy only grew, with every new detail, every update, fueling the public's appetite for drama. Marcus's face was plastered across TV screens and social media feeds, his name tied to a crime he hadn't committed. Even as the facts of the case slowly came to light, the damage was done. The court of public opinion had already made its ruling. And then, a breakthrough. A young store employee, a woman named Sarah, came forward. She had been working the day of the robbery and had seen everything. At first, she had been one of the employees who had doubted Marcus, who had assumed the worst. But after seeing the surveillance footage and realizing how wrong she had been, Sarah decided to speak up. In an interview with Marcus's lawyer, Sarah admitted that she had heard the initial accusations against Marcus, but didn't believe they were true. She described how, in the chaos of the robbery, it had been easy for people to make assumptions. But as the dust settled, the truth became clear. Marcus had been there to help, not to hurt. Her testimony was crucial. It was the first step toward clearing Marcus's name. But even as the legal tide began to turn in his favor, the damage to his reputation remained. Public opinion was a fickle thing, and while some were willing to admit they had been wrong, others clung to their initial biases, unwilling to let go of the narrative they had constructed. Marcus knew that even if he was exonerated in the eyes of the law, the stain of this incident would follow him for the rest of his life. The day of the final hearing arrived with a heavy air of anticipation. It had been weeks since the robbery, weeks of relentless news cycles, public debates, and sleepless nights for Marcus. His face had become a symbol in the city, but for reasons that were far from the heroic narrative he deserved. The legal system had finally started to piece together the truth, but the stain of accusation lingered like a cloud that refused to clear. Marcus sat beside his lawyer in the packed courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Linda was seated behind him, her presence a quiet strength. She had been with him every step of the way, refusing to let the storm tear them apart. Her face, though tired from the strain, was set with resolve. They had endured the worst of it together. But today was about clearing his name once and for all. On the other side of the courtroom sat the store manager and a few of the employees who had been present during the robbery. They avoided Marcus's gaze, their discomfort palpable. Sarah, the young employee who had come forward with her testimony, was not among them. She had chosen not to attend the hearing, but her statement had already been submitted to the court, testimony that would prove critical in Marcus's defense. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, entered the room, her black robe sweeping behind her as she took her seat. The courtroom fell silent as she called the proceedings to order. Today's case concerns Officer Marcus Carter, who has been accused of involvement in the robbery at a luxury store downtown. We will hear final arguments from both sides, after which the court will deliver its verdict, the judge said, her voice steady and authoritative. Marcus's lawyer stood first, presenting the defense. He walked the court through the events of the day in question, highlighting Marcus's heroic actions in subduing the robbers and preventing a much more dangerous outcome. He referenced Marcus's impeccable record as an officer, his dedication to the city, and the numerous commendations he had received over the years. Most importantly, he emphasized Sarah's testimony, that an employee had seen Marcus attempt to stop the robbery, not participate in it. He recounted her admission that, in the chaos and panic, assumptions had been made based on nothing more than snap judgments and racial prejudice. Officer Carter was not just doing his duty as a police officer that day, Marcus's lawyer said, his voice calm but passionate. He was doing something we expect from all our officers, protecting the public, even when off duty. He didn't have to act, but he did. He stopped what could have been a tragic event, and yet here he stands, accused of a crime simply because of the color of his skin and the prejudice of those who failed to see the truth. We ask this court to exonerate Officer Carter fully, for his actions that day were those of a hero, not a criminal. As the defense concluded, Marcus felt a faint glimmer of hope stir within him. His lawyer had laid out the facts clearly, compellingly. But the prosecution still had their turn, and Marcus knew all too well that the damage had already been done in the eyes of many. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a hard expression, stood up and made his case, leaning on the initial accusations from the store's employees. He didn't dispute the fact that Marcus had helped stop the robbery, but he insinuated that Marcus may have known the criminals, or at the very least, had acted suspiciously enough to warrant the store's mistrust. The argument felt thin, even to Marcus's ears, but it didn't stop the prosecutor from pressing on. He painted a picture of uncertainty, trying to convince the court that the situation was murky, that there were too many unknowns to dismiss the accusations outright. But as the prosecutor continued, it became clear that his case was unraveling. The contradictions in the store employees' stories, the absence of any evidence linking Marcus to the robbers, and Sarah's powerful testimony had undermined the prosecution's narrative. By the time the prosecutor finished, his words seemed to hang in the air, hollow and unconvincing. The judge remained silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Finally, the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence, including the testimony of Officer Carter's colleagues, the store employees, and the critical statement from Sarah Miller, I find that the accusations against Officer Carter were based on unfounded assumptions and racial profiling. There is no evidence to suggest that Officer Carter had any involvement in the robbery beyond his heroic actions to stop it. The words hit Marcus like a wave of relief, but he remained still, his body rigid with the weight of it all. I hereby declare Officer Marcus Carter innocent of all charges, the judge continued, her voice firm. This case serves as a reminder of the dangers of snap judgments and the impact of racial bias in our society. Officer Carter, I commend you for your actions that day. You upheld your duty with integrity, and for that, you have this court's respect. The courtroom was silent for a moment, as if the words had yet to fully sink in. Then slowly, a murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling in her eyes as she reached for Marcus's hand. Marcus, however, sat still for a moment longer. The relief was there, yes, but so was the deep, lingering sense of injustice. He had been exonerated, but the damage had been done. He had fought his whole life to prove himself, to be more than the stereotypes that followed him. And yet, even after being cleared, he knew the shadow of this event would follow him for the rest of his career, and maybe even the rest of his life. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for a statement. Marcus's lawyer advised him to keep his words brief, but Marcus knew he needed to say something. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been judged, labeled, and falsely accused because of their skin color. Standing before the cameras, Marcus felt the weight of the moment, but he also felt a sense of clarity. What happened to me is not just about one man being falsely accused, Marcus began, his voice steady. It's about a system that too often makes decisions based on appearances, based on stereotypes. I was lucky enough to have a platform to defend myself. Many others are not so fortunate. Today, justice was served, but that doesn't mean the fight is over. The crowd of reporters buzzed with questions, but Marcus didn't linger. He had said what he needed to say. The rest, he knew, would be a long and ongoing fight. As he and Linda walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, Marcus felt both a sense of victory and a sense of sorrow. He had fought for his name, for his dignity, and he had won. But the fight against prejudice, against the subtle and not-so-subtle ways it manifested in society, was far from over. Back home, as Marcus sat on the couch with Linda, the world seemed quieter. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. Yet there was one thing that gave him hope. He was not alone. His wife had stood by him, his lawyer had fought for him, and people like Sarah had chosen to speak up when it mattered most. And though Marcus knew there was still much to be done, tonight, for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of peace.